Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name's Kim Driscoll, and I'm going to be your host this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New Brunswick Adoption Foundation carries out its work on the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties, which has established an ongoing relationship between these nations and the British Crown. We pay respect to the elders, past and present, honoring Indigenous knowledge keepers, and remain committed to listening, learning, and strengthening our relationships with the Indigenous communities. As an organization supporting vulnerable children in the care system, we share these words with humility, respect, and hope. I'm very excited to have Sarah Wilson presenting The Connected Brain. This session is going to offer you an accessible introduction to applied education, neuroscience, as it relates to early trauma, felt safety, and the neurodivergence many adoptees navigate. It is designed to bridge research, lived reality, moving between theory and practical understanding in a way that respects the intelligence and the experience of everybody in the room. Before we dive into our discussion, I want to take a moment to remind everyone about our network and upcoming programs. So the NBAF is a nonprofit organization. We aim to promote and advocate for children in the permanent care of the province. So our vision is that every child or youth in the permanent care of the province finds a permanent family. So we have our French support group on July 22nd, late night talks on July 23rd, and while you're waiting on July 28th. If you're having trouble locating any of these registration links that are on our website, please get a hold of any one of the coordinators and we'd be more than happy to send that to you. Couple of housekeeping items to get through. So we want you to get the most out of this presentation. I'm going to encourage everyone to switch to speaker view so you can focus on a presenter. We love engagement here, so please use the chat feature throughout the presentation to ask questions or share comments. You can find the chat by pushing those three little dots at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to use the raised hand button at the bottom of your screen as well. The raised hand one is going to be at the end of the session when we open that 30-minute Q&A at 9:30. We are going to take a few questions throughout Sarah's presentation. So if you have a question to put in the chat from 8 to 9:30, that's wonderful. If I don't get to you, we're going to get to you at 9:30, okay? We greatly appreciate if everybody could take that 1 minute to answer those 5 quick questions. Your feedback is invaluable in supporting our ongoing work. And now the most exciting part of the night is I get to hand you over to Sarah. So Sarah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and to share some of the knowledge that I've learned over the past, I don't even know how many years now, with all of you. And hopefully it'll be an interactive and engaging session. So let me just share my screen. So before we get started, I just want you to kind of check in with yourself and notice where you are right now. Not physically, you can notice that too, but check in with where you are in your day, in your week, and in your nervous system. Have you been rushing? Were you in back-to-back meetings all day and then you have to hit the home routine, which is probably a bit off because summer, right? Did you almost skip the session because of everything else that's going on? So that awareness, that right there is where I'd like to start today, because everything that we're going to talk about tonight begins with that question. Where am I right now? And how does that affect everyone around me? So I'm just going to give you an invitation to be curious about that as we kind of go through the presentation. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you to do a little activity. It's called a focused attention practice. I use this all the time in my classrooms. We're going to do a container hold, and only do this if you feel comfortable. If you're not comfortable, that's okay. But if you're comfortable, I'm going to ask you to begin by placing your right hand under your left armpit and your left hand on your right shoulder. And so once we get into this position, as we breathe in, we're going to give ourselves a little squeeze. And as we breathe out, we're going to slowly release the squeeze. And I'm going to get you to breathe in through your nose. And as you're doing this, so let's take a breath. Let's breathe in and give ourselves a squeeze. And then breathe out. And you can do that again as I'm talking. Just keep slowly doing that. Breathe in and squeeze, breathe out and release. I want you to notice the sensation of your hands on your body, the gentle squeeze that you feel, and the release. If your mind wanders, you can gently bring it back to the sensation. So we're going to do this 3 times, and then we're going to switch sides. So we're going to breathe in, breathe out. We're going to breathe in, breathe out, and breathe in, and breathe out. And so we're going to switch sides now. We're going to switch armpits. So we're going to take our left arm, put our left hand, put it under our right armpit, and our right hand under our, what am I saying here? I can't talk. Anyway, just do the opposite of what you're doing. So this is a really good practice to help us feel grounded and steady if we're feeling anxious or unsettled. We can do it for a minute or two until we begin to feel a bit calmer in our nervous system. And one of the reasons that we want to do this is that if we have dysregulation in our bodies, dysregulation in our nervous systems, what happens is we're living kind of in our limbic area. We're living in our emotions. We're in the teenagers are in their feelings, right? We're in our feelings when we're a little bit dysregulated. And it's harder to access your prefrontal cortex, which is where learning happens. So we want to be able to access our prefrontal cortex. We want to give ourselves a little bit of a squeeze so that we can get back to that so that we can learn. So we're going to do that again. We're going to do that 3 times. So now that we've given our body a bit of a grounding experience, I just want you to notice where your nervous system is in this moment. And I just want you to be curious about that. Okay. My screen is looking a little bit weird. Is it looking a little bit weird to you as well?
No, very clear on this end.
Okay, it's flashing on my end, so I'm just going to assume it's okay. All right. So I study what helps humans flourish. That's in classrooms, that's in workplaces, communities, and families. My background is varied. I started off as a financial advisor and then worked in internal communications for a long time. And in internal communications, my focus was really on how do we create safety in the workplace. I then moved into education. I have a master's of education where I focused on neurodivergency. I have a certification in applied educational neuroscience. I have a lot of different degrees. I'm a lifelong learner, and I don't know if I'll ever stop learning. I'm a mom of a neurodivergent family, and I also do consulting, speaking, facilitation. So you can see my credentials, but to be honest with you, the ones that matter the most is that I'm a parent of a neurodivergent family, and everything that I've learned about neuroscience, about regulation, about connected parenting did not begin in a classroom. It began in my own home, sitting on my living room floor crying, trying desperately to understand and connect with my son. My son has given me permission to share his story. So I'm going to share a little bit of his story because he has a deep desire to help other kids who are like him. So I didn't really know anything about neurodivergency other than really stereotypical things you would see on TV or hear in the news until my son was born. And then around 18 months, we just started seeing behaviors that I really didn't understand, and traditional parenting advice did not work at all. If anything, it made it much, much worse. A lot of this was happening as we were trying to get help and trying to get support because he was so young, but he was also very like he was very advanced. So he didn't have the stereotypical kind of things that we look for when we're looking for autism and things like that. His vocabulary was very high. At like 18 months, he had the vocabulary of like a 4-year-old. So we really kind of fell through the cracks, so to speak. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we were very much were on our own to try to handle a lot of what was happening. And a lot of what was happening was a lot of dysregulation. And so I was dysregulated, my son was dysregulated, my husband was there was a lot of dysregulation, and it was very isolating. And so I got really curious about what was happening. And through that, I came across the book, The Explosive Child by Dr. Ross Greene. And that was just totally a life changer for me. And from that, I learned that kids do well when they can. And to be honest, human beings do well when they can, if we really think about it. And when they aren't doing well, it's really an opportunity to get curious about kind of what is happening in the world of this child. And so the next part that I'm going to share, I want to acknowledge that some of what I'm going to describe may be upsetting, it may be uncomfortable, it may be hard to hear. And particularly if you're an educator, I do talk a little bit about my son's experience in school. And so I want to be really clear that my intent is not at all to assign blame, but to invite reflection and dialogue. These experiences are really personal, and it's not entirely my story, but I would just ask you to think about what was happening in our systems. And when I say systems, like our bodies and, also the systems we live in that allowed this. And I'm going to ask that we all kind of hold space for any discomfort that might come up. And some of the things we're going to talk about tonight, you might already intuitively be doing some of these things or be aware of some of these things. And so this might give you the science behind why some of what you're doing works. So with our story, it began with, like I said, explosive behavior. And a lot of shame. I had a lot of shame about what was happening because everybody was acting as if this behavior was so abnormal from my child. So you can see in the lower left-hand corner that there's a picture of a child that is in a cage, and there's people around that child pointing and laughing. And so that is my son's experience with school. He spent a lot of his really early elementary years being put in sensory rooms, being locked in sensory rooms. He has a lot of school trauma. And there was a lot of shame because when we were trying to get help, we weren't able to access the help we needed. Nobody really understood what was happening. And a lot of the parenting advice in my son's case wasn't working. And that's because my son has pathological demand avoidance. So it's a really different way that you have to parent if you have a child who everybody has demand avoidance. But if it's, my son would, I want to eat, I'm hungry, but I refuse to chew. So it's when it gets it interferes with your ability to kind of live your life. That's when it becomes kind of pathological. And in the neurodivergent community, they actually are trying to change that. So I came across the work of Dr. Laurie Desautel, who is a professor at Butler University, and it was transformative. So I came across Dr. Mona Dillahook. I read her book. So I started kind of getting into neuroscience without even realizing I was getting into neuroscience. But I was kind of getting into neuroscience because I was trying to really desperately help my son because, like I said, we were at home. There was a lot of, like I said, a lot of dysregulation, and I was getting hurt a lot. There was a lot of anger, and it was being taken out on me. So through understanding what was happening with the brain and the nervous system and relationships, everything started to change. We met a neuroaffirming occupational therapist who basically said, your child is not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time. And that just really blew my mind. And I realized he was probably having panic attacks when he was at school. And that's kind of what was happening. And so as I started learning more and more about how our brain structure works, it got me thinking about my childhood. And as I've gone through this process, I've since realized that I am neurodivergent, my husband's neurodivergent, and my younger son's neurodivergent. And so that there's some grief in that process of realizing in late stage that you are neurodivergent, and also a lot of hope for me. Not everyone feels that way, but for me, it was a lot of hope. But it is hard sometimes when you weren't diagnosed when you were younger. But let's get back to connected parenting. It isn't about getting our children to behave. So I'm talking about behavior, but it really wasn't about getting my child to behave. It was about understanding what the behavior is communicating and then me responding in ways that helped both the children. So what that helped both my children and me feel safe enough to be able to connect with my child. So parents, especially those that are raising children with really big feelings, big emotions that can show up as explosive behavior, they often carry an enormous amount of shame because their homes don't look like the peaceful sanctuary that they see on social media, right? It doesn't look the same. And there's a lot of shame in that because what am I doing wrong? There's a lot of shame when you're constantly being told, for example, in daycare, like every single day, it's just kind of a litany of complaints about your child's behavior. And in my case, it got to the point where I had to say, like, okay, is this neurobiologically normal or should I be calling my doctor? Like, what are we talking about here, right? And so there's a lot of shame and a lot of isolation. It feels really lonely a lot of the times because it's not, you can't necessarily, with my child, I couldn't go to all the fun play dates and do all of the things that all my friends who had babies the same age were doing. It just didn't work for him. He just couldn't do it. So I had to meet him where he was at. But it was really, really hard for me because, and we were talking about this earlier, I'm an extrovert. I like being around people, especially when I'm trying to learn how to be a parent, how to see other people parent. What are they doing? What am I doing? And so the neuroscience tells us a different story. Regulations, when we hear a lot about regulation and dysregulation, it isn't a constant state of calm. And we're going to talk more about that later. We're going to watch a video that talks about that. It's really a process of adapting, recovering, and reconnecting. And we do this every day, in and out. We kind of go through all of the different phases. And it's more like riding a wave than actually reaching a destination. And that understanding, once we understand that, it can take so much shame out of the room. And I know this because I've lived it. I actually had blocked care with my son, and we're going to talk about what blocked care is. But I really struggled to connect with him, and we're going to talk about why that was. But for years, I carried shame about not enjoying being a parent while I was also trying to understand my own neurodivergence and understand my own history of trauma. So shame doesn't tell us we've done something wrong. It tells us we are wrong. That's what shame does. Brene Brown has great talks about shame. It thrives on secrecy and impossible expectations. And I remember thinking, what kind of a parent admits that they don't necessarily love being a mom, right? I felt completely alone, convinced that if anyone truly saw what was happening in our home, that they would judge us. And to be honest, it wasn't even what was happening in our home. I was getting judged all the time. We would go out to restaurants or go out to the library, and I saw the looks from parents, right? I knew. And what changed wasn't becoming a better parent. It was really understanding the science of what was happening and extending radical compassion to myself, radical compassion to my son, and realizing that struggle is not evidence of failure. It's literally part of being human. So that's kind of how I got into this. And through that, I just keep studying more and more and more all about this because it's so fascinating and I'm so interested in what makes us thrive. So before we can even kind of think of look at this, we have to look at kind of who is this child? So we know there's more than 70 years of research that has shown that a child's ability to learn, regulate emotions, solve problems, and build healthy relationships is deeply influenced by whether they feel safe and secure. When a child's nervous system is locked in a state of survival, we know that self-management, resilience, and effective collaboration are incredibly difficult to access because you're living in your limbic state. And we're going to talk more about what that means, but you're not able to access your prefrontal cortex. And one of the things that's wild is without us even being aware that we're doing it, every experience that we have, our amygdala, so our reptilian, our reptilian brain, as sometimes they call it, but our amygdala, that what puts us in survival state, that part of our brain that puts us in survival state, is constantly scanning below the surface It's called neuroception. It's constantly scanning below the surface for, is this safe? Is this safe for survival? How does this work with survival? So without us even being really aware, that's what our nervous system is doing. It's checking in. Is this safe for me? And before we get into any kind of the neuroscience, I want to kind of talk about the kids. So when I was putting this presentation together, I looked it up, and there's approximately 8.3 billion people in the world, right? So as of yesterday, I think I looked that up, there's 8.3 billion people in the world. That's a massive amount of unique stories, family combinations, identities, life, cultural dynamics. So we know that there's no single kind of parenting experience. There's no single kind of adoptee experience. Some of you may be parenting a child who came home with you as an infant. Some of them maybe came home when they were older. Some of them maybe lived in different houses. So everyone in this room comes with a different dynamic, different perspective, different needs. Some of you may be educators. Some of you may be professionals supporting people. Some of you may be parenting a child who remembers everything. My son remembers a time before his brother was born, and his brother was born when he was 18 months old, and he remembers specific things. And it's really hard because he remembers not having a brother. And so some of you may be in kinship care where the loss is tangled up with family relationships that may still be ongoing. Some of your kids may be thriving in ways that surprise people. Some may be struggling in ways that don't show up anywhere on paper, or in our case, it was only showing up in our house, right? At first, it was only showing up it wasn't showing up anywhere else. So other people didn't see it. And it was only when it started kind of progressing, his brain was developing more, that started showing up in other ways. But for a long time, other people didn't see it, and we kept it hidden, right? Because of the shame. It thrives in secrecy, right? And so all of these experiences are true. You know, it's all true at once in this room right now, that we all are coming through different experiences and different backgrounds and different perspectives. So nothing I say tonight is meant to describe your child specifically. It's meant to give you a lens which you'll be able to kind of look at your child with and hold up a lens and see, like, okay, how can I meet this child where they're at? And so one of the hard things for caregivers to hold is that a child can have no conscious memory of their early loss or disruption, but they still carry it. The nervous system encodes experience long before the brain can put language or narrative to it. So you might have a child who came home at 3 weeks old who has always been safe with you, but they still have the nervous system that learns somewhere in those early weeks that the world wasn't reliably responsive. And that's just how early development works. It's not about assigning a diagnosis or a story to every child, but it's about staying curious about what might be underneath some of the behavior that we see, even when there's no real clear reason that you can necessarily point to. And so the somatic sequence of how it works is that first we have a feeling. So children live in the world of sensations, right? Then an emotion, and then a thought. And that's because of how our brains develop. So we have to view behavior through a neurosociological lens to acknowledge that a child's body speaks before their cognitive brain is even invited to the conversation. That's just how it works. And one thing I do want to point out here is that relationships are key to human survival, right? We've heard so much about how, I can't even remember what they said last year about empathy is dead or empathy is terrible or whatever, but like relationships, which include empathy and compassion, right? It's a biological imperative. Human beings survived as long as we did because we had relationships. And relational wealth, we don't talk about it enough in society, but relational wealth, those relationships we have with somebody that's not necessarily our parent, but an aunt, a teacher, a coach, something like that, that relational wealth is really, really important for our children's brain structure and architecture, because in those moments, they don't necessarily have to mask if they're neurodivergent. They can just be authentically who they are. And so I think it's really important also to remind ourselves, and this one was really hard for me. I remember somebody saying to me before I had my first child, I can't even remember what we were talking about, but they said, it's kind of crazy. You have all these ideas of what you're going to do as a parent, And they're like, but it's kind of crazy because it's like, you are going to the airport to pick somebody up who you've never met, you don't know anything about, you don't know what they like and what they don't, and you have this full agenda of all of these amazing things that you're going to do. And then you get to the airport and that person hates hiking, doesn't like seafood, doesn't want to sleep in a hotel because it's too loud, for example, and can't handle being in cars. They get car sick. And those were literally all the things that you had planned to do with them, right? And so you're in this position where you have these expectations of what it's going to look like, but then the person who shows up, the individual in front of you, is not necessarily what you were expecting. So we don't decide who our children are or how they're wired, but we do have influence over how they feel about those things and how safe they feel when they come to us, when they're experiencing life, and how we help them and how we respond to them and how we work to accept them for who they are wired to be. And that's kind of a really important reframe. And that applies whether your child is 18 months or 18 years old. Very young children are already reading whether you can handle what they're feeling, not whether you can fix it. They're asking whether you can be with it without flinching, without shutting down, without needing them to feel differently so that you can feel okay. That's kind of the beginning of felt safety. And we're going to come back to that phrase in a few minutes. And so in the studies, I think it was between 12 and 18 months, children are already demonstrating that they know whether or not their parents are able to handle their emotions. And so the harder part is that sometimes the child we're holding isn't the child that we imagined. And so maybe because, you've adopted somebody, so a child, so maybe you've had this idea of what it's going to be like. And maybe you pictured that it was going to be an easier attachment process because you've wanted this for so long and you have so much love. Maybe you expected a different temperament, a different pace of healing. But our job is not to parent the child that we kind of imagine. It's to see, know, and honor the actual child in front of us as they are, not as we hoped or expected them to be. And for me, that was really hard because I didn't understand my son's behaviors. I didn't understand what was happening. Like I said, I had to have radical compassion with myself for how I had felt. And then as I learned better, I was able to connect better. And so we need to ask ourselves, who is the child underneath the behavior we see? So to answer that, we have to have a talk about what our nervous system has been doing the whole time.
Over half of us have a chronic disorder such as high blood pressure or autoimmune disease. Rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and addiction are skyrocketing. Why? The roots of these issues and more can often be traced to trauma, adverse childhood experiences, chronic stress, and ultimately, nervous system dysregulation. Meet your autonomic nervous system. Let's call it ANS. ANS takes care of a lot of your automatic functions, like your heartbeat, digestion, and body temperature. ANS also manages your survival and stress response, working to keep you alive when your life is in danger. ANS functions as our built-in detection system, constantly scanning our environment for cues of safety and cues of danger. As ANS scans the environment, it has 3 general responses or states. Safe. You feel calm, relaxed, and connected to those around you. Mobilized. When ANS detects danger, it sends a command and your heart rate and breathing increase, adrenaline and cortisol are released, and blood rushes to your muscles so you can handle the threat. This is our fight-flight response. Immobilized. When ANS detects that the danger is so great that you can't fight or run, it shuts you down. In this state, our heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature decrease, and pain-numbing endorphins are released. ANS does all of this automatically without us thinking about it. ANS doesn't just use these states for survival. It uses them to navigate through the world each day. When ANS functions well, it moves fluidly from one state to another, 1 minute mobilized and ready for action, and the next resting and recovering. ANS will often blend states together. When we play, ANS combines the mobilized and safe states. And when we are intimate with loved ones, it combines immobilized and safe states. When ants can stay flexible and fluid like this, it helps us manage and become resilient to stress and negative events. We're able to bounce back and move on. Unfortunately, when we experience trauma and chronic stress, it can keep ants from functioning in a healthy, regulated, and resilient way, and can keep us stuck in states of survival. A friendly get-together can become frightening. A simple meeting at work can become threatening. For those with a history of trauma and chronic stress, the ants detection system often becomes faulty, constantly signaling danger even when we are safe. It's like ants as an alarm system, constantly signaling fire even when there's no smoke and no flames. Consistently living in these survival states can be debilitating, and we often develop adaptive strategies like using drugs, alcohol, food, work, or sex in an attempt to bring regulation and temporary relief. Understanding how trauma impacts us is critically important. There is a whole spectrum of experiences that can be traumatizing and adversely impact ants, like accidents, assaults, and natural disasters, which are often called shock traumas. There is also developmental or relational trauma, when we experience chronic adversity, abuse, neglect, and lack of safety while growing up. Many other experiences can be traumatizing, including chronic stress, medical procedures, and adverse community environments, like poverty, discrimination, and violence. Additionally, new research in epigenetics shows us that trauma can get passed down genetically at least 3 generations. In the past, we've thought about trauma as events that happen to us. We now know that trauma is an experience, not an event. It's what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. It's our response to the event rather than the event itself. Over 20 years ago, Kaiser and the CDC launched a groundbreaking study of over 17,000 patients that showed a direct link between adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and long-term health and wellness. In the study, 2/3 of participants reported at least one ACE. Over 20% reported 3 or more. When participants reported 4 or more ACEs, this corresponded to an increased chance for heart disease, cancer, drug abuse, and more. With 6 or more ACEs, life expectancy decreases by almost 20 years. We are learning that many physical and emotional symptoms may emerge from a chronically dysregulated ANS. When ANS gets stuck in survival states, our biology shifts its focus from the tasks that keep us healthy, happy, and thriving to surviving the immediate perceived threat. Many conditions and symptoms that are chronic and difficult to diagnose and treat can be attributed to a dysfunctional ANS. Our childhood experiences can also keep us from connecting with others. This is vitally important because as children, our #1 survival priority is to attach to caregivers. When the people responsible for our safety aren't safe, and we are living in chronic states of unsafety, ANS doesn't get wired right. The part of ANS that judges what is safe and what is not becomes faulty. If intimacy and connection were unsafe as a child, as adults we'll often unconsciously reject attempts from friends and partners to connect. Even though intimacy and connection is what we want, ANS feels it's unsafe and won't allow it. Trauma compromises our ability to engage with others, replacing the need for connection with the need for protection. When there has been trauma, ANS can no longer differentiate between our unsafe past and our now safe present. ANS can't turn off the need to protect, even though we are now safe. So what can we do when ANS becomes dysregulated? How do we recover from trauma and develop a healthy, regulated, resilient nervous system? Fortunately, we can retrain ANS to feel safe again. This is best done with the help of others. Each one of us has an ANS, and our ANS is constantly communicating with and attuning to the states of others. We autonomically mirror the states of those around us. This is called co-regulating. We see it in herd behavior. If one animal senses danger, the entire group becomes more alert, increasing their chances of survival. We're exactly the same. When we're with others who are stressed, angry, or depressed, it makes us feel worse. When we're with others who are calm and happy, It makes us feel better. Connecting with others who are safe, attuned, and present is the best way to restore a healthy ANS. For those struggling to recover from the impacts of trauma, there is an emerging field of innovative clinical therapies that have been developed to reestablish safety and regulation to ANS. We're also learning that many of the activities we intuitively know make us feel better, like spending time in nature, practicing yoga, dancing, helping others, and more, can help ANS become more regulated and resilient. Healing from trauma and finding release from being stuck living in survival states comes as ANS becomes regulated, increases its capacity for resilience, and regains its flexibility. It's not about being calm all the time or mobilized all the time. It's about having a flexible and resilient nervous system that can accurately assess safety and danger and responds appropriately. We're truly resilient when we can fluidly move from one state to another. For those living with the impacts of trauma and chronic stress, becoming unstuck is like beginning a new life. For the rest of us, understanding how our nervous system states guide our behavior can help us become happier, healthier, and more empathetic human beings. Collectively, we have an epidemic of social issues that are rooted in trauma. If we can do the work to heal past traumas and build healthy, regulated nervous systems as individuals, families, and communities, we can end the cycles that continue to reinforce our greatest challenges and create a safer, vibrant, and more connected world.
So for those of you who, maybe this is the first time you're hearing about adverse childhood experiences, maybe it isn't because it's something that you would talk about. I will say that for me, what they say about becoming unstuck, so I have a very high ACE score. My ACE score is 6. And so when I saw the studies, I was like, oh, that's awesome. But I had a lot of protective factors. I had a lot of relational wealth. My grandparents were very involved my mom was a single mom. So my grandparents were very involved in helping. I lived with my aunt and uncle a lot of the time in the summers and things like that. I had a lot of relational wealth that protected me from some of those factors. And for those of you who may be interested in learning a bit more, there is a book. I don't know if you can see that. It's called Childhood Disrupted: How Your Biography Becomes Your Biology and How You Can Heal. I feel like every single doctor should read this book and should get a patient to do an ACE test before they start helping them, because there's so much in our health that is related to if we've had trauma and how we've been able to process it or not. And so for me, that book was just really, really affirming, really eye-opening. And it has, the beginning is a lot of statistics that might scare you. And then it moves into what are the protective factors. And then it talks about how you can help yourself if you have had a history of trauma. So it's something that you may want to consider doing if it's something that you're interested in. And so with the nervous system, if we talk about the nervous system, and so a lot of this is Dr. Bruce Perry's work, who originally studied kind of the neurobiology of trauma, because they used to think that children couldn't have trauma. They would treat kind of veterans for like PTSD and things like that, but they didn't think children could actually have trauma. And so his work has been really transformational. And so when we think about it, we need to remember that the behavior that we might see that maybe prevents us from connecting with our kids is not a moral response. It's a nervous system response. And so your kids are not choosing this. They're not choosing to be dysregulated. They're not choosing to, appear to be misbehaving, right? And so if we talk about Dr. Bruce Perry's work, and recently Oprah, I think, did a book with Dr. Perry. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but they've been talking about it. But if we think about the fact that the human brain contains about, we're going to get a little bit into the science here. The human brain contains about 80 billion neurons, and each one can form thousands of connections with other neurons. Those connections, which are called synapses, that's what allows us to learn, remember, adapt, and grow. And the remarkable part about our brains is that they're not static. They're experience dependent. So every interaction, every relationship, every repeated experience is literally shaping the way those neural networks get organized. And I like to think about it using something we all would have learned in elementary school. So the 3 states of water. I heard Dr. Perry talk about this, and he used this analogy, and I loved it. So if you imagine a pot of water that's boiling, the steam rising from it, it's incredibly dynamic. So there's a lot of molecules there, right? And if you gently blow on it, it immediately changes direction. It takes almost no effort to influence it. And that's a little like the brain in early childhood, in utero and in their first stages, right? When we are born, for example, when we're born, our nervous system takes over. So our nervous system at the time that we're born, all it's responsible for at that time is breathing, regulating your temperature, and eating. That's it. And then it grows. It starts to grow as you've been born. So there's all these synapses that are happening, right? There's incredible malleability, but that can be a double-edged sword. Positive experiences, when there's all that malleability, can accelerate the learning or the development, but early stress or neurotoxic exposure can have a meaningful impact, even if it's for a short period. So during those early years, the brain is forming new neural connections at astonishing rates. It's incredibly responsive to experience. Loving, predictable, and attuned relationships. So attuned means you're attuned to how your child is feeling. So you're attuned to kind of what's going on with them. That helps build strong neural pathways. Chronic stress, fear, or chaos shapes those pathways too. The brain, though, it's not deciding, is this a good experience or is this a bad experience? It's just asking, what happens here? What's happening here? And when we remember that everything goes through the amygdala to assess if it is safe and compatible with survival, then it builds itself accordingly. And that's when we get stuck in survival. That's when we can get stuck in a survival state. And so as children grow, the brain is still wonderfully adaptable, but it starts to stabilize as we get older. So think of this stage like water. If you push on water or stir water, it moves, but it takes more force than it does with the steam. You have to put more pressure, you have to do a little bit more. And so if we think about it, to give an example in numbers, in the 3rd trimester, the fetal brain can create 20,000 neurons per second, whereas in an adult, you might make a few hundred a day, right? So that's really dynamic. So change is still happening though, right? Even as you're getting older, change is still happening. Learning is still happening. The brain starts becoming more efficient by strengthening the pathways it uses most often and pruning away those that it doesn't. So for example, if you were a middle child and you felt like you were never heard, you might have started yelling to get attention, and it worked for you. So your brain is pruning that and telling you, oh, that worked for me. I got my mom to listen to me. So that worked for me. So your brain is telling you that's what I need to do, right? That's a little bit of a simplistic explanation, but that's kind of how it works. So by the time we reach adulthood, around our mid-20s, the brain has largely completed its structural development, especially on the prefrontal cortex. And that is when we are more like ice. So ice doesn't stop moving. It simply takes more energy to reshape than steam or water. And I think that's one of the most hopeful things that neuroscience has taught me. As I said, for many years, scientists believed that once the brain was fully developed, we didn't know a lot about the brain, right? We didn't know a lot. And so over the past 70 years, we've learned so much more. And so people used to think that once the brain was fully developed, it was essentially fixed. But we now know that that's simply not true. Throughout our lives, our brains remain capable of change, and that's called neuroplasticity. So as adults, creating new patterns takes more repetition, more intentional practice, the 30 days to set a habit, right? That's the neuroplasticity. And often what you need in order to effectuate the change is the support of safe relationships, but change is absolutely possible. So during the Olympics, I absolutely loved the Olympic champion, Eileen Gu. She was asked, how does she answer questions so thoughtfully? And she's young, right? I think she's 22. And her response did just that. She said, you can control what you think, you can control how you think, and therefore you can control who you are. And she says, I'm 22. So with neuroplasticity on my side, I can literally become exactly who I want to be. Now, I wouldn't necessarily phrase it that way because it's not as simple as I can be exactly who I want to be. But she's talking about the neuroplasticity of being able to change intentionally. And so our experiences shape us, but they don't have to define us forever. So even though I have a high ACE score, it doesn't have to define me. And I don't have to be held back because of trauma that I experienced when I was younger. So every single time that we experience safety instead of fear, curiosity instead of shame, and connection versus isolation, we're giving the brain new experiences that it can build from. And that's why this work matters so much. We're never trying to create a perfect brain or a perfect family. We're humans. What is perfection, right? What our goal is we're creating repeated experiences of regulation, connection, and safety, because those experiences literally become the architecture and the foundation that the brain builds itself around.
Sarah, do
Yeah.
you mind pausing here for a moment for a question?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So Carolyn is asking, what age would you say brains become less malleable?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so I think it's around 22, 25, I think is like when we move into adulthood, that's when it becomes more like ice. But our brains are pruning and they're doing all of that. So as we're getting older and older, it is becoming more thick, more structured. And there is a really, if you want to know like the actual like if you're like, I'm really nerdy, so I love it. But if you wanted to learn the actual neuroscience, you can't see it because it's blocked, but brain-based parenting. And I've got these all shared in the slideshow. So you'll see them all in the slideshow. Brain-based parenting, it talks about all of that. It tells you everything that's happening all within your brain. And so generally speaking, 25 is the age when your brain is fully kind of developed. And so I would say, I think it's up to 3. 3 is when it's like highly, highly, highly dynamic. And then after 3, again, you're moving more into the water versus the steam. You're moving more into, it's going to take a little bit more because we have those lived experiences. Our brain is pruning, it's figuring out what's working for us and things like that.
That's an excellent answer. Can I touch on that a little bit?
Yeah.
By asking a part B to that, which would be for those of us with neurodivergent children with brain-based challenges, disabilities such as autism, FASD, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
How many experiences do we need to provide our children with that are in a positive way to create that felt safety compared to those children who were born into felt safety? Like we feel as sometimes our participants feel that they struggle no matter how much they co-regulate, how their voices calm tones. Like, we do all the strategies that we're always taught,
Mm-hmm.
but yet our children's brains don't and bodies don't seem to be able to accept it.
Yeah. And Kim, that is a really wonderful question. And I think it's really complex and nuanced because if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. And so it's really hard to necessarily say that it's going to be this or it's going to be that. Generally speaking, they say with your executive functions. So your executive functions are your impulse control, your emotional regulation, time management, those things that we need to learn, right? So your executive functioning skills, they generally say that people who are neurodivergent are about 3 years behind neurotypical individuals. And so I would say they're probably about 3 years behind. But again, it's really individual because of the brain wiring. But generally speaking, they're about 3 years behind where their neurotypical peers would be.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. So next, we're going to kind of talk about our ancient reptilian brain, the brainstem. So we're born with a functioning brainstem, which is about 500 million years old. My son and we were just reading a book about evolution, and it was talking about this. So it was kind of neat. We're talking about Darwin. And so it's often called the reptilian brain. And again, when we're born, it's what controls our basic survival functions automatically without thinking about it. Our breathing, our digestion, our sleep, our stress responses. Newborns don't need to learn those. They just happen naturally. But when something feels unsafe or unfamiliar, your heart might race, your mouth dries, you might shiver. That's your brainstem. And so Dr. Laurie calls it the CEO of your regulation. And it's firing up beneath your conscious awareness. And that's all because of the reptilian brain. But it fires up when we get dysregulated, because when we get that kind of, my sister and I used to call it the uh-oh feeling. We'd kind of get like a bad vibe or something, right? We'd get an uh-oh feeling. And we may not even be conscious that we're feeling it, but our amygdala is constantly scanning. Is this safe? Is this safe? Is it good for survival? And that's the reptilian brain. It fires up when we get dysregulated, because when we feel unsafe, it's especially to children who need a lot of co-regulation. They need a lot of modeling of regulation and self-regulation and co-regulation. And so for children, especially when they get dysregulated, when that brainstem goes off, it is literally to them as if there is that saber-toothed tiger standing behind them. So to you, you're like, with my son, I'd be like, I just offered you mittens to go outside. And because of his pathological demand avoidance, it would be that to him would cause a lot of distress for him. He'd get very dysregulated. It would not feel safe for him, probably due to the sensory input of putting the mittens on. That sensory overwhelm, because he has a lot of sensory issues, would lead to that dysregulation. And so that dysregulation is functioning underneath the behavior that we see. And those behaviors are very often misunderstood. It's changing, but often, meltdowns were treated as non-compliance. But when we think about it, a freeze response, especially in schools, I talk about this when I go into schools, a freeze response could be viewed as success because the outward behavior that you were seeing has stopped. But inside, the child is still dysregulated. And so they're still trapped in survival mode. So what you're seeing may look like, oh, okay, well, the behavior stopped, so it's fine. But that child is still underneath the surface. They don't have felt safety. They don't feel safe. They're still dysregulated and they're hiding it, right? And so the amygdala is our brain smoke detector. It's located above the ears. It's almond-shaped clusters of neurons. That's our amygdala. And it detects threat. So everything we sense, both externally and internally, runs through the amygdala for a quick appraisal of its survival value. And when it activates giving off stress signals, it can actually shut down your prefrontal cortex, preventing higher order thinking. So a lot of times those strategies of use your words to kids, it doesn't work because they can't access where language acquisition actually takes place. So a lot of times those things, when I'd say to my son, use your words, tell me what's going on, he would get more and more dysregulated because he was not capable. He was in the sensations. He was in his feels. He was in his emotions. He couldn't access his words and tell me what was actually happening, right? And so children who suppress stress signals to get approval learn that those survival cues that they're experiencing are wrong, right? So they're saying, I feel unsafe. But then when they're told by their parents, just get on with it or whatever, it's not an accepted behavior, then they learn that the survival cues that are telling them are wrong. And that can sensitize the stress system over time. And it can have people living in a survival state. And so for me, I was in a survival state until my 40s because I had no idea what was happening. I just knew I was constantly anxious. And I just thought it was normal. I didn't really, really fully realize how much it impaired me until I had children. And then I had 2 under 2. I had really terrible postpartum anxiety. It was just this perfect blend of all these things happening. And I really went into survival state. And I lived there for a long time. And so Bruce Perry's work shows that repeated activation of stress responses without regulation, so without someone helping them co-regulate, without them being regulated, sensitizes the stress system, making children more reactive over time. So it actually creates more of that explosive behavior. And so when we think of labels like ADHD or anxiety or autism or any of the other kind of labels that are diagnoses that children get, it's really helpful for understanding. But we have to remember the underlying biology. We also have to acknowledge that many children, many children who are neurodivergent have trauma from existing in a world that is not made for them. It's stated, and there's a number of different people who this is attributed to, but it's stated that children who have ADHD hear 20,000 more negative things about their identity and their behavior before they're 12. I think it's 12, right? So think about what that does to your I am statements. Your I am statements become I am bad, right? Your I am statements become I'm a horrible child. My son, he says that all the time when he gets dysregulated. I'll hear him muttering, I'm a horrible child. I'm a horrible child. And I tell my kids all the time, protect your I am statements. You made a bad choice. You're not a bad person, right? Because behavior is not a moral response. It's a nervous system response. And so we have to remember the underlying biology. So a lot of times when we have children who are neurodivergent, there's an additional layer of there would be the trauma from, being adopted and that, but there would be an additional layer of trauma from existing in a world that doesn't accept them and being told that they're wrong. I do a lot of talks at schools about supporting neurodivergent learners, and we talk a lot about the double empathy problem. And the double empathy problem is basically that when neurodivergent people and neurotypical people communicate, we have communication breakdowns because we communicate differently. But because of the way our society is established, the neurotypical person is generally seen as more right. And the neurodivergent person is seen as being difficult or challenging or too rude or whatever it is. And so the neurodivergent person is being told that they're the issue, when in reality, it's mutual, right? It's not just the neurodivergent person that's having a problem. The neurotypical person isn't able to communicate. So even if a child knows the right response, to get back to the brainstem, even if a child knows the right response, the brainstem can override it. So even if they're in their cortex and they know what the right thing is to do, the brainstem can override it if they feel unsafe or overstimulated. And I see that struggle in my son all the time. He's 10. So he's starting to get to a point where he is better able to kind of regulate his emotions. But I see a lot of times where I'll just say something and I can tell he's like, oh, he's dysregulated, but he's trying to do the right thing, but he's not really able to do it. And I see the struggle on his face. Right? And this is a really important thing when we all of being a parent is teaching a kid, modeling for them, helping them learn, right? But you cannot teach a child to learn, to share, to learn to problem solve, to follow directions if their brainstem thinks that they are in danger. They will not be able to learn because their brain is telling them there is a saber-toothed tiger behind you and you are going to die. So when we think about that, we have to prioritize the well-being, the safety, and the co-regulation. It has to come first. And so there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot more going on than the labels of ADHD and autism when we think about it. And so here you can see on the screen that to the left is a cortex that's turned on and fired up. We can think clearly, we can reason, we can pause before we say anything we regret. We can have good, strong working memory and sustained attention. And it's sending information all through our nervous system. But then on the right is a reddened area in the limbic area where the amygdala is. So a few decades ago, like I said, the school of thought was that the brain was immune to inflammation, but neuroscience has shown that when there's excess cortisol, and cortisol is the stress hormone, when there's excessive amounts of cortisol, it wreaks havoc on brain tissue. And so in young children, cortisol isn't just a stress signal, it actively shapes how brain regions responsible for memory, learning, and emotion develop. Studies show that children with higher long-term cortisol tend to have smaller volumes in the hippocampus, especially the areas that form memories. And so we also know, because of kind of our little science talk, that early experiences have outsized effects on development. And so when we understand the brain as a dynamic, sensitive system, it helps us set realistic expectations for ourselves and for our children. It helps us provide safe, predictable, nurturing environments. Children need that. Children need to have a safe, predictable, emotionally available, consistent adult to help them be able to feel safe. And we can support learning and regulation from where the child actually is versus where, the piece of paper, because of their age, tells you they should be. So even small intentional actions like providing consistency, connection, sensory supports can make a real difference in children's brains. One of the things that I did with my child when I was really young and struggling to connect is, and I can't remember where, maybe it was Face that showed me this, but it was basically sit down with your child, put anything that's going to distract you away, and let your child lead the play. So if that child was to pick up a doll and hit the doll, you don't correct them. You are curious about what are they going to do next. So instead of correcting them, you're just kind of curious and you let them lead the play. And that created, by allowing my child to do that, I gained a lot of insight into kind of some of the stuff he was experiencing, but it created a connection because I wasn't distracted. I wasn't looking at his brother. I wasn't trying to do other things. It was one-on-one time with him where he was able to show me what he wanted to show me. So when we think about our day-to-day interactions with our children, we're not just teaching skills, we're shaping the structure of their developing brains. And our role is to create experiences that are safe, predictable, and nurturing. And that's neuroscience in action. And it's the genesis of it is understanding how malleable the early brain is. And so when we look at behavior, every single one is the nervous system's best attempt at solving a problem. It's maybe not a good solution. Like I said, if you were that middle child and you wanted to get attention because everybody was always talking over you. I remember my cousin, I have 4 cousins, and one of my middle cousins, he constantly, like, his brothers and sisters were constantly like, he never got a word in edgewise, right? And so he would have behaviors that would show up because he was desperate to get somebody to, like, just pay attention to him, right? And so every behavior is really an invitation for us to be curious. The solutions the kids come up with may not be as socially acceptable solutions, but it's always trying to solve something. And our job is really to get curious about what. So if we look at their refusing to start a homework or piano lesson, maybe they don't know where to begin and it feels overwhelming. Right? Maybe they leave the room abruptly and their nervous system needs to regulate before they can stay there. My son does this a lot, argues with every request. He needs to feel some control in an environment because generally speaking, he doesn't necessarily feel safe. Maybe they have their head down, they won't respond. They've shut down to survive. They can't access you right now. My younger son does this a lot. He really struggles when he gets overwhelmed. And with him, one of the ways that I connect with him is he's super silly. And so I'll just approach him with an invitation to connect by doing something silly. So we might have a silly joke between us, or one of the things I do is we just got a dog. And so I use a funny voice when I'm pretending I'm using the dog's voice. So I'll see if he's if he's open to connecting with me, because he can't access me, can't look at me, can't access me. Maybe disrupting others constantly. I'm dysregulated. My body feels dysregulated. I don't know how to say it. Maybe they have sensory needs that are not being met in that moment. And so they are constantly disrupting because their body just feels like out of control. And maybe if they were to sit in a sensory swing, or if you were to wrap them up like a burrito and kind of roll them, maybe that would give them the input. But again, that's individual to each child. But there's a really cool, so this book is by Dr. Laurie Desatel, and it's Connections Over Compliance. Again, I have pictures of these at the back. This one is really cool. It's for educators. It's written for educators, but at the back of the book, it talks about, if the child is in their limbic brain, here's activities that you can do. So like drumming, draw the beat, EFT tapping, taking a sensory bath. And so it's really cool because it has ideas at the back so that if your child's dysregulated, you could do one of these activities and that actually helps regulate the nervous system. So for example, with my child, one of the things is in all of our cars, we have sour candies because eating a sour candy kind of shocks your nervous system. Also ice cold water. We always have bottles of ice cold water because taking a drink of ice cold water and kind of swaying regulates your nervous system, right? And so there's lots of different techniques. And like I said, this book has a lot of techniques based on, if they're in their emotional part of their brain, if they're in the sensations part of the brain, if they're in their prefrontal cortex. How can we connect? How can we give them the needs that they have? And so when we look at the behavior as communication, it shifts from how do I stop this behavior to what is this behavior trying to tell me? And what does this nervous system need right now? And so here's kind of the great part and the hard part is that your own regulated state is the first intervention. So how many of you have noticed that your child seems to escalate faster when you're already stressed? Like all the time, right? It's because their nervous system is reading your nervous system, and your nervous system is telling them there's something to be stressed about, right? And so we spend so much energy collecting strategies, the right words to say, the right consequence, the right redirection, and all of that has its place, but none of it works if you're delivering it from your own dysregulated nervous system. And that's because your child's nervous system reads yours in a fraction of a second, faster than you can choose your words. The minute I walk into my classrooms, my students have read my nervous system. My kids have read my nervous system when I walk into the room. And that's neuroception. It's the automatic below conscious awareness scanning that your child's brain is doing of your face, your voice, your body, the energy you're giving off. They're checking for safety or threat. And if you walk in flooded, tense, or activated, that's the information that lands first, regardless of how calm you make your words sound. And that's why the same script that you might use on one child can land completely differently depending on your internal state. So you could say, I hear that you're frustrated, and you say it through gritted teeth, and that registers as a threat cue, not a co-regulating one. So in your mind, you're like, okay, or this, maybe I'm speaking for me because this is me. I'm like, okay, I know the right thing to say. I know that I need to have empathy. I need to have compassion. So I'm going to say I can see that you're really frustrated right now. Right. And my kids are reading that as it's not safe. I'm not actually available to connect with them because I'm dysregulated. If you say it with a settled, open body, it can help bring your child back into their window of tolerance where they're able to regulate themselves with your help. So the zone where your child can still think, listen, and problem solve is kind of the window of tolerance, and it ebbs and flows. So it's never going to be the same. So we pay a lot of attention to, if we have a really busy day, I'm always building in a slower day the next day. And it's really hard because our society is just go, 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 right? So before we get into any specific techniques, I just want us to recognize that we need to be prioritizing our regulation in order to be able to regulate them. So I'm going to invite you to check in with your own nervous system right now. And this is something I did when I did my applied educational neuroscience. We had to do it 3 times a day. So morning, noon, and night, or you could do it at different times. And you basically just printed this sheet off and you would put in, where am I right now? Where am I right now? And we had to do it for a month. And that was one of our assignments. And I can tell you, it was so eye-opening. I didn't realize how much stress I carried in my body. I didn't realize how, I forget to eat a lot. And so usually at noontime, I would be stressed because I had forgotten to eat, right? And so I'm just going to invite you to check in with your nervous system, and I can provide this to you if you wanted to use it, but you can just write it on a piece of paper too. How am I feeling? Set a timer and remind yourself. And Dr. Lori Desautel, I have a short video that she talks about that. So this is kind of the pillars of applied educational neuroscience. And as I learned about applied educational neuroscience, I started thinking about all of our public services and how, if we understood this, how much different our society would be if we had trauma responsive practices in our public services. So I'm going to walk you through these really quickly. It says here, educator nervous system. Let's change that to adult. right? Behavior management is about adults. I can tell you most of the times where my child got really, really dysregulated at school, it was because other people in the room were also dysregulated, and it took things up a notch, right? And so our brains and bodies hold the state of our nervous systems, and it takes a steady adult to settle a child or adolescent. If you're dysregulated, you will never be able to regulate somebody. Co-regulation, it's a biological priority. Kids don't really kids need a lot of co-regulation. They are not able to really regulate their emotions very easily. It starts to get better, and then they hit their teen years and everything kind of goes haywire with all the different hormones and everything. But kids need a lot of co-regulation. Particularly neurodivergent children need a lot of co-regulation. It's when we share a safe, emotionally available sanctuary of space, a trusting presence. A lot of times when I co-regulate my kids, I'm just sitting with them. I'm not talking to them. I'm literally just sitting with them, and I'm showing them that I'm a safe harbor. Whatever they're going through, I'm there with them, right? Touch points, those are micro moments of connection, and it often happens with our facial expressions, tones, greetings, noticings. I have a resting witch face, and so my son has a nonverbal learning disability, so he would frequently ask me, he'd be like, Mama, why you look like this and not like this? Like, meaning, why are you frowning and not smiling, right? So when I'm thinking, that's the face I give, but to him, that made him feel unsafe. He didn't understand why I would have that face, because he was reading my facial expressions to see where is she at? How is she, right? And the language of the nervous system. I think that the more that we start prioritizing and teaching people about the language of the nervous system, the better off we're going to be, because it's how we got in recycling. It's how we got people to stop smoking. We taught kids about kind of those things, and then they shamed us into doing it, right? And so when we teach children about the language of the nervous system, and I saw this with Dr. Lori, it gives them relief. They can name it. They can talk about it. It's no longer scary. I was in a group book club, and there was a woman whose son had a very similar profile to my son's. He was older, but her son went to a school where they were all together from junior kindergarten to grade 8. It was somewhere in the States. And so she went into the school and explained to the kids what she knew about her son. It wasn't the neuroscience, just what she knew about her son, what was happening that she could see. So now the kids, he's in grade 4, and now the kids are like, oh, Jonah looks like he's getting dysregulated. Let's go get a water bottle of ice cold water for him. Maybe he needs the wobble chair. They start becoming they can help regulate them too. Like my son co-regulates his brother for sometimes, not all the time, sometimes siblings, right? Like they're tough, but this is applied educational neuroscience. This is the foundation. But to me, when I saw this, I saw the world of possibility for so many other practices, not just teaching. And so I struggled a lot with this idea throughout my childhood, and it followed me into adulthood. So I did not feel safe a lot growing up. I didn't know that that's what was happening, but that is why I had survival state, and it followed me into adulthood. And so as a parent, it's really hard because you've built a stable home, or a caregiver, like taking care of kids, you've built a stable home, you've been consistent, your child is by every kind of measure safe, and still they don't act like it. They test you, they push, they seem to expect the worst, even when the worst hasn't happened in your house ever. My son does this a lot, and I'm like, could you just please give good intentions? Like, instead of thinking your brother is intentionally trying to make you mad, maybe try to look at it through the lens of maybe he's just genuinely curious. So I'm constantly trying to get him to frame his perspective, not that someone's out to get him, but that nothing bad's going to happen to him. And that's the gap between safe and feeling safe. Safety is a fact about the environment. Felt safety is a state of the nervous system, and it's built slowly through repeated experience, not through a single explanation or a single good day. You can't tell a nervous system it's safe. You can only show it over and over until it starts to believe you. And it's not your failure if your child doesn't feel safe yet. And it's not your child's failure either. It's neuroception. It's that automatic below awareness scanning system. And for a child whose early scanning system learned that caregivers may be unpredictable or maybe not safe, that system doesn't just reset because the environment changed. It has to be retaught slowly through consistency. And part of this is because people don't respond to the world in front of us. We don't. We respond to our internal map of the world. We respond to our lived experiences of the world. We respond through our stress response system, our sensory thresholds, past trauma, developmental stages, neurodivergency, our attachment patterns. That's the map. So a child that's hitting a peer isn't responding to reality. They're responding from, this feels unsafe. I don't know how to get help. Big bodies scare me. I'm overwhelmed by noise, whatever their perceptual map is. And when we know that trauma and adversity and chronic stress literally reshape the map, it gives us the ability to be curious about what happened to this child so that we can better understand that they're not responding to what's happening in front of them. They're responding from their internal neural state, their stress load history, all of that. Two children can be in the same household, hear the same directions, and have completely different reactions, not because of the instruction, but because of their map. And so this leads us to a term that may reframe a lot for you. Maybe you've already heard of it, but block trust. And this is what happens when a child's attachment seeking system, the part of them that would normally reach out for comfort, deactivates. Not because they don't need connection. Remember, connection is a biological imperative, right? But at some point when they reached for connection, it didn't work, or it wasn't safe, or it wasn't there. So the system adapted and it stopped reaching. And that can look like a child who seems to reject you exactly when they need you, being unable or unwilling to get comfort from caregivers when they're distressed. It could be hypervigilance, always being on edge and needing to control situations, people, or outcomes to feel safe. Maybe refusing affection, so withdrawing, becoming silly, exhibiting rudeness when a parent shows warmth, as closeness to them may feel like vulnerability. And so the child is going to push you away. They're going to push that comfort away because that feels safer than allowing themselves to be vulnerable in that moment, because when they were vulnerable before, nothing was there for them, right? The child who seems almost allergic to being cared for, it's not defiance, it's not manipulation, even though it can feel that way in the moment. It's a nervous system doing exactly what it learned to do to survive. It made sense for them at one point, and the work now is showing that system patiently and repeatedly that it doesn't have to keep doing that. And so if you've been met with rejection, dysregulation, or pushed away over and over, that can lead to blocked care, where your own caregiving system can start to shut down too. And it's really fascinating. I studied this in a course I took on popularity about 10 years ago. Research has shown that when we experience rejection, it activates the same part of the brain that is activated when we're physically hit or hurt. So when we experience rejection, it is the exact same connections that somebody hit you. It's the same thing to your brain. It doesn't differentiate. It's a neurobiological process that happens. And when this, when caregivers have repeated rejection or dysregulation gradually, their own caregiving system goes into distress, right? And that's called block care. And if you felt it, it could be a numbness, it could be a resentment, it could be a distance from your own child. And maybe that scares you, but I want you to hear that's a real documented human response to sustained relational stress. It is not evidence of being a bad parent. It's evidence that you're a human and that your nervous system has been asked to keep giving without enough return for a really long time. And the hard part is block trust and block care can feed each other. A child who's guarded triggers a caregiver's own system to protect itself. And that caregiver's protective distance then confirms for the child's nervous system that connection isn't reliable. It's a loop. It's not a character issue on either side. And so everything's filtered through the amygdala to determine if it's good for survival. And so if any part of this has described something you felt, I want you to know that that's not something to carry alone. There are people that are trained specifically in this that can help. Traditional parenting strategies often backfire on children with block trust because they interpret boundaries or punishments as threats to their safety. So there's PACE model, so playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy, that focuses on lowering the child's fear, building predictability, and moving at a pace the child's nervous system can handle without triggering fight or flight. In my case with my child, oh yeah, sorry.
No, sorry. I thought you were taking a pause there. So I was
Oh,
just going to tell you it's a 10-minute warning.
yes, thank you. So in my case, I didn't stop loving I had blocked care. I didn't stop loving my child. My capacity to access connection was impacted by stress, uncertainty, postpartum anxiety, and a nervous system that was extremely overwhelmed. Due to the time, I'm going to jump over, but you can see that underneath I have acute, child-specific, stage-specific, chronic, and those are different types of block care. And if anybody's interested, I'm happy to share more information on that. I'm going to kind of jump over this, but the piece I really want us to focus on is the rupture. So when you have this rupture, that's not the danger. It's if we don't take the time to repair, if we're not able to repair. And the really, really cool thing is that we only need to really get it right 30% of the time for children to feel securely attached to us. Now, I haven't seen the studies on children who have had trauma or on children who are neurodivergent who have trauma. I haven't seen necessarily the studies on how much of a percentage you need to get right, but generally speaking, you really only need to kind of get it, that the rupture and then the repair from it, you really only need to get it right about 30% of the time. And your child will still feel securely attached to you. And so that's really exciting, right? And so I want to move to this because I want to leave you with some practical things that we can think about. So what does this ask of the adults in the room? And so this is something I was going to do. It's a physiological sigh. I'm not going to do it, but this is, again, you can look at the presentation. This is a really, really great regulating activity that's super easy to do. You can do it anytime. It takes less than 60 seconds, backed by neuroscience research from Stanford. And it's I use it all the time. And so we've covered a lot of ground tonight. The nervous system, felt safety, block trust, block care. And I want to be kind of honest with you about something before we close. There's not really an exact sequence of words that regulates a dysregulated child. There's no 5-step technique that builds felt safety on a schedule. And so I hope that nobody's disappointed. But the shift that I'm kind of asking you to look at is to add to your toolkit. It's kind of in your posture, how you hold yourself in relationship with the child, especially in those hard moments. And so we have to remember that what we believe subtly becomes what children experience. So kids know, my son always knew when teachers didn't like him, he always knew. So if you believe that your child is going to misbehave or that they're bad or troubled, that's going to influence how they view themselves. And so it's really important that we really give ourselves that opportunity to be curious about the behavior and not kind of put those labels on it. And so before we look forward, we have to look backward. We have to look at how were we parented? What did our nervous system learn about big emotions? One of my really good friends, big emotions, they're like, oh, I gotta go. Like they just panic when there's big emotions. And I'm like, how can you even be friends with me? Like I've got huge emotions all the time. But you want to ask yourself, were the adults around you able to stay calm when you were distressed? Did they become overwhelmed too? We didn't enter parenthood or caregiving as a blank slate. We brought with us a nervous system that was shaped by years of experience. It has a default way of responding, a default tone, a default presence. And just as we kind of talked about earlier, your child's nervous system is reading those cues long before they're processing your words. And so, like I said, I had to really sit with the fact that I have a resting witch face. When I'm thinking about something, my tone might sound clipped. And for my children, that really distresses them. And so I have to work on that. I have to be mindful of that. So what do? I tell my kids, you know what, I'm thinking about something right now. So if I look this way, that's why. Or if they're like, why do you sound like that? I tell them, I've got something on my mind and I'm just thinking about, like, I have to say out loud what's happening. I'm going to show us this short video. This is Dr. Lori. This is a nervous system check-in. I love this. This is something similar to what the polyvagal thing is, but let's take a look. The quality isn't too great.
As I promised last week, I am continuing to share short videos with practices for us as adults. to really help us move through some tension, some anxiety, some worry. So what I've been doing over the last several months, not consistently every week, but just recently, I began for 3 weeks in a row, setting my alarm on my phone 3 times a day. And when it goes off, no matter where I am, what I'm doing, it is an instant pause for me. And it's a check-in just to see, where am I in my nervous system, in my state of consciousness? Am I feeling steady and grounded right now, creative in the flow? Am I really upset? Am I worried? Am I anxious? Who am I with? Who did I just talk to? What is my self-talk like? What environment am I in? And this is fascinating. So it's tracking your nervous system, but it's doing it in a way where you are intentional about those pauses, but you kind of forget about it. So I hope you'll enjoy this and think about patterns, think about trends, set that alarm, do it with family, and just think about how recognizing, being aware, and focusing on, we fall off. I mean, we're not always, regulation is not always about being calm. It's really about being aware. And so I hope you'll enjoy this, and I would love, love, love your feedback.
So I really like doing that, but what does this posture that we're presenting actually require practically? It takes a few things and none of them are easy. We have to have our own regulation first. Your nervous system is the first tool in the room, and it only works if you're regulated. So one of the really cool things, if you're a woman in the room, we talk about a regulating factor. For men, it's dopamine. For women, a regulating factor is oxytocin. Oxytocin, you can do it by, rubbing your arm, getting a hug. So oxytocin, the more we can bring in oxytocin when we're dysregulated, hugging your child, hugging your spouse, the more we can bring that in. That's a regulating influence if you are a woman. If you're a male, it's dopamine. So it's a little bit different what you're going to look to help you kind of regulate yourself. And so you also need to have honest self-reflection. And that's about your own history, your own triggers, the moment where your child's behavior lands on an old wound of yours. I know I get triggered when my kids do things I was never allowed to do. I was always told I was too loud, I was too much, I was too big. My mom and my sister were super introverted and I'm very extroverted. And so I was always told those things. And so when my kids are doing the things that I was reprimanded for, you better bet that I get dysregulated, because how dare they be allowed to do it? And I wasn't. But it took me learning about this and learning about myself and figuring out those triggers for me to allow me to not let it trigger me. You need to have a tolerance for uncertainty. This work rarely gives you a clear timeline or guaranteed outcome. But the work that you do, I can tell you that connection before correction is the biological priority, because if we are trying to connect with our children, if we are trying to teach our children how to be just good human beings, we need them to be able to access their prefrontal cortex. We need them to be able to feel regulated. And so putting attention on the connection you have with your child and that felt safety is so critical. So what I focused on when we pulled our child from public school, I focused on a year of just connecting, just calming things down and connecting and letting his nervous system just completely regulate. I took off any expectations of learning. And oddly enough, he learned like wild, like it was like wildfire. Once his nervous system was able to calm down, once he was met where he was at. And you need to be predictable, consistent, and emotionally available. So I'm going to ask you, what's one thing you're carrying forward into your specific home, your specific child, your specific week? I'd encourage you to think about that. And I'm just not going to show that video, but I am going to show these for the neuroscience of connection and attachment. These are the books that I would 100% recommend. The one in the upper right-hand corner is almost more like a journal. It is faith-based, so just to let you know, but these are kind of the experts in kind of connection. So Raising Securely Attached Kids was a wonderful read. And then here are some of the people that I follow, some of the books that I have read that have influenced the work that I do. And the neurodivergent parenting, think outside the box. She has wonderful, wonderful talks about co-regulation. So if you're like, I need to learn how to co-regulate a little bit differently because her co-regulation is very different. She's raising 2 neurodivergent children, one with PDA. Absolutely fantastic resource for co-regulation that just is a little bit different than some of the co-regulation techniques. So it's 9:30, so I'm going to end there.
Wow. Great on time. Well, and we wouldn't mind if you went over by 5 minutes or so. Is thank you so much for that. That was such a great presentation.
Oh, I'm
Um,
so glad.
in it, I learned a lot about how early relational trauma, it gets carried into our children's nervous systems, and then that shapes how they see the world around them, in so many different ways, what they perceive, what they know to be true, how they feel, that felt safety. We talk about
Yes.
that all the time too. So like I love, and today I really loved how you talked about connection versus correction. We
Mm-hmm.
talk about that a lot in our daily conversations with caregivers. So it is definitely one of those for us
Well,
fundamental learning
and when I
strategies.
and for sorry to interrupt,
No,
and
I love it.
I'm so glad that that is kind of one of your foundational things, because when I think about this, I think about this a lot, right? Connection before correction. When we if we think of discipline, so a lot of times as parents, we have your child's misbehaving. What are you going to do to control them? What are you going to do to rein in that behavior? So we feel like we need to correct them. And so sometimes we're not even correcting them for the child, we're correcting them for the other parents or grandparents or whoever is around us. When really what the child needs is connection in that moment. The correction can come later. Because if we think about the word discipline, we think of disciple, that's to teach, right? It's to teach. So if we could reframe our lens on discipline to be to teach, I really think that we would have much better outcomes, because kids don't always need to have like some consequence, some terrible thing happen for something. Now, my kids both, they learn through natural consequences. Unfortunately for them, they always have to learn through natural consequences. And it's really hard to watch as a parent. It's really hard to sit with.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And we give examples with a lot of our families and caregivers to say like out in public, it's so difficult for caregivers and parents and new
Yeah.
parents, etc., to have such disapproving glances and looks on people's faces. Or sometimes people are very bold and they'll say, "Correct your child," right?
Oh,
Um,
100%.
and yet I'm all about like, okay, if they're in Walmart, they're in the cart and something's going on, it's like, okay, come on out of the cart. I'll sit on the floor with you over to the side, away from everyone, privacy for us,
Yeah.
connection, and then I co-regulate, it de-escalates, the child will go
Yeah.
back into the cart, we're connected, and then when we go home, we can talk about like what is something else, like when you want that toy and mom says no, what else could we do? Or when mom says no, this is what it means because
Right.
etc. We don't have to
Well,
answer to our children, we need to teach them, we're modeling what we want them to do for anybody else.
Well, and if you were having the worst day of your life, which for these kids, when they're dysregulated, that's what it feels like. Wouldn't you want somebody to meet you with compassion and be like, "Hey, I see you're having a really hard time. Can I help?" And to be really blunt, we have cut people out of our lives who are not safe for our family. We have had family members that we have cut out of our family, be like our not like we weren't like they're not our family anymore, but we don't spend time with them because they're not safe for my kids. I don't want my kids to feel like what they're doing is wrong or bad, or that judgment that we get. And so we have been very rigid almost in making sure that everybody who's with our kids are safe for them.
Well, I love this. I'm gonna pause for one moment here.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to give us time to stop this recording, and we're going to move to the Q&A. As we all know, again, it won't be recorded. And then Sarah is going to be able to focus on answering some of your questions. If you're watching this through a recording, please know that next time it's great if you register for our programs and attend that evening if you can, because this is one of the great parts too, is that you get to ask Sarah questions one-on-one. So I'll give a second. Oh, and at the end, you'll see a little survey too. And again, don't forget if you could take a moment to fill that out.